The UN says its humanitarian air service is up and running again in Afghanistan. That means food will finally be able to reach those who need it most. The country was already dealing with a drought and COVID-19 even before the Taliban took over. And of course, winter is coming, and I think it's quite crippling in Afghanistan. Joining me now via Skype is Mohsin Khan. He's a former director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department at the International Monetary Fund. Mohsin, thank you very much for joining us. Let me ask you this. I've been speaking to several people the last few days who are painting a picture of what it's like in Kabul right now. One journalist in the last hour basically said to me that, people are selling their possessions. People are struggling to put food on the table. Prices are rising. What's the situation? If funds are not lifted, if they don't unfreeze these international funds, what happens to Afghanistan economically?
Well, Lisa, thank you for having me. I think it's a very difficult situation that they have in Afghanistan. And to answer your question quickly, is that the country will implode. To get a perspective on how much they depend on foreign aid. Sort of 90% of the salaries of public sector employees were covered by aid. 30% of the overall budget, civilian budget of Afghanistan was covered by the what's called the Afghanistan Reconstruction Fund, which is aid. So if aid doesn't start to flow back, and that seems very unlikely. And if sanctions aren't lifted and they don't have access to the $7+ billion held in the United States, at the Federal Reserve in the United States, owned by the Central Bank of Afghanistan, then I think the situation is going to become really dire. And furthermore, the IMF has decided not to disperse the $450 million or so that they had promised as part of COVID relief. And the World Bank has stopped its funding of projects in Afghanistan. So all in all, if absent a resumption of this, the economy will implode. I mean, some people have made estimates like, GDP could fall by 11% or 10% or something like that. I think that's very, very optimistic because it could fall by much more.
What's your prediction, how much it could fall by?
I think if we get into that scenario where their aid comes to a complete, aid does not resume at all, it could very well fall by a quarter. I mean, by 25%, easily.
And like you said, it does depend so heavily on imports. And we're seeing an inflationary environment. We've been hearing and seeing people queuing to get money out, the concern over a run on the banks. Is there a way that the IMF can release not all of these funds, but part of these funds bit by bit and have a monitoring body to see if the Taliban is abiding by a set of rules? What is the way around this?
Well, there really is no easy way around it because, Issa, you have to remember that the IMF is not an independent entity. I mean, it's basically answers to its shareholders, and its major shareholders are the ones who are withholding the aid. So the IMF can only Afghanistan is, of course, a member in good standing with the IMF, but it has to have an internationally recognized government in order to deal with it. So for the IMF, it will be absolutely necessary that the United States and the European countries, who are the major shareholders of the IMF, say that this government, they can work with this government and they can deal with this government, and they recognize this government. Once that happens, then the money can.
And that's why it's so important, obviously, why we're putting into perspective why the world is waiting and watching Mohsin to really get a sense of what kind of government they will announce, how inclusive that will be. Do you believe if that meets the criteria of those, if that meets some of the criteria from some of the other countries, whether the United States or elsewhere, that perhaps those funds will be unfrozen?
I think that if the United States and other countries come to that conclusion that, look, this is a government that is a legitimate government, and we recognize this government, the moment that happens, both sanctions or it's because actually Afghanistan is not under sanction. I mean, basically, it's the assets have been frozen, and so basically, it's a question of unfreezing the assets, not a question of lifting sanctions. The moment they unfreeze the assets, then and Afghanistan has access to them, the IMF can immediately start to disperse its funding to that's already in the pipeline.
Mohsin Khan, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us here on Quest Means Business.
Thank you very much, Isa.